Okay, so now, ladies and gentlemen, we will be having the inaugural address from our chief guest, Dr. Bertram, and he has come all the way from Washington, D.C. for this conference. We are really grateful to Rob, and not only for this conference, but for many other initiatives which he is supporting in international agriculture. And as Ikri said, we are also grateful to him for all different projects, different initiatives. So please join me in welcoming Rob Bertram for this great talk. Yeah.
Okay, this is all right. Very good. Which way do I point it? Anywhere? This way. Okay. Yeah, and then, okay, fine. Okay. Always need a little help from my friends. Thank you very much, Rajiv. But I do want to say that you stole my thunder. I was so excited to hear Secretary Patnaik's announcement. And I can't think of a more fitting capstone to the global year of the pulse, which was 2016. So once again, I just think that's spectacular news. Really wonderful. And hopefully with that added production will come added affordability so that more people will be able to eat more pulses, one of our most nutritious and important foods. USAID was very pleased to collaborate with ICAR in supporting, and with ICRISAT in supporting Interdrought 5. And it's very, very gratifying also to see the strong support from the government of India and from all these partners, public and private sector, and of course all of you. So we really couldn't be more gratified than to see you all here for this important meeting. When Rajiv asked me to speak, I have to admit to you that while I was honored, I was also a little daunted. Here you are, drought scientists, and here I am coming to talk to you about drought in a room of experts. So what I thought I might try to do instead is to provide what I would call a development investor viewpoint, one that reflects food security goals, but also our research agenda and development goals. So I'd like to begin then on providing some context on global food security efforts and the efforts to end hunger, say a bit about risk management, look at drought and climate and what drives decision making, look at some strategies to address drought risk, say a bit about USAID, how we approach this issue, and then wrap up with a few summary messages. So let's see if this works. There we go. So before I start, I want to just say there are many reasons to be encouraged. Hunger and poverty are declining. Nutrition and agriculture are joining together, and the focus on pulses is a good example of that. Stunting rates are coming down. We have a better understanding of stunting, and as Secretary Patnaik mentioned, we have a tremendous commitment from the global community in Sustainable Development Goal 2. In my own country, just last year, we passed the Global Food Security Act of 2016. So despite any current uncertainty, my hope is that we will continue to have strong support. We have very strong support from our Congress, both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. And so I think that's an encouraging sign. One thing I want to mention to you about the new law that will guide our food security efforts in the United States is that in addition to poverty reduction through economic growth, broad-based inclusive economic growth, and nutrition enhancement measured by reductions in stunting, the law added a third area for us to work on, and it's resilience. And the idea here is that we try to work to prevent a shock from leading to a crisis. So my sense is that the implications of that change for the work that you do and that we all do in trying to manage risks like drought is very significant. This just illustrates the gains that have been made over the last 20 years. As you can see, undernutrition rates are down. Poverty is declining, although Africa is lagging. That's the top dashed red line. And then still very importantly, the scourge of micronutrient deficiency is very important. This is a marker for inadequate diet. It's a marker for people not having enough pulses in their diet or enough dairy or vegetables. So we've still got a lot of work to do. Also, despite the progress we're making, I want to underscore the urgency of all of our efforts. There are still more than 3 million preventable child deaths every year linked to undernutrition. So despite the progress we're making and the enthusiasm we have for the development goals, the urgency is absolutely critical. So let's keep that in mind as we seek to achieve that goal by 2030. So the US government's approach to the food security effort is known as Feed the Future. I just list here some of the aspects of our work that you may find interesting, but the one that's highlighted is the role of research and science and technology. I also want to say a bit about how we work, which is that we look to our partner countries to lead. We focus a lot on gender and the role of women in agriculture and as economic agents and leaders. And we have a big focus on accountability metrics that measure our progress on stunting reduction, on extreme poverty reduction, on hunger reduction. And we do this at population-based levels. We don't just look at the projects, we measure the outcomes across the entire population of the zone we're working with. And of course, we're doing this allied with other countries, our G7 partners, our G20 partners, and all the partner countries we work with in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, looking at research a bit more, in the US context, we think of our role in USAID to leverage and connect the best science, and this is around the federally funded science in the United States, to the human outcomes that we seek in the Global Food Security Act. So we use our precious and limited research dollars, only about 12% of the total of about $1 billion total at Feed the Future, to work with national partners, with universities, with the CGIAR centers, and with the private sector to bring the potential and the opportunity of science to bear on solving the problems facing the world's smallholder farmers in ways that provide more food, better food, and affordable food for low-income people everywhere, consumers or producers. Now, at USAID, when we thought about how best to do this, we created 7 program areas, but I'm only going to focus on 4 of them here. The 3 long-term research areas at the top: climate-resilient cereals, named thus because we know cereals are so sensitive to climatic factors. Also, legume productivity, and I'll be very happy to talk about the achievement of India when I go back to Washington. This was taken primarily from the perspective of enhancing nutrition, but this is, we know true that legumes are also very sensitive to heat and drought. And then the third area for long-term investment was leveraging advanced technologies on diseases of tropical crops and livestock. And this is more, for example, looking at things like livestock disease or in vaccines, or some of the crops like banana, where we don't think a lot about drought, or even some like cassava and sweet potato, where science against disease can make a big impact, but they're already fairly drought tolerant. So when we really think about drought in terms of our crop work and livestock also, we're thinking about the cereals and the legumes, and to some degree pastoralist animals and animals that depend on rain-fed environments. All of these areas come together in what we call sustainable intensification. That's the center of the slide. And what you see there is basically a highlighting of regions where we overlaid child stunting and extreme poverty with also agricultural potential. These are the densely populated breadbaskets and rice bowls of the world, and these are also, somewhat ironically or counterintuitively, the places where extreme poverty and undernutrition are concentrated. It's in these densely populated rural areas. So you can see the four that we focus on: the Indo-Gangetic Plains, the Sudano-Sahelian zone, the Ethiopian highlands, and the mid-elevation mixed maize-based systems in eastern and southern Africa. And sustainable intensification is the program where we try to put all the science together in the context of these important farming systems. Now, to say a little bit more about sustainable intensification, here's where we start to get to drought. Less risk is the concept, greater upside potential and productivity, and that the concept is that those two things together will lead to greater investment by farmers, by governments, by the private sector. So we seek to increase productivity. We also know that through this process of sustainable intensification, we're reducing emissions intensity, so it's climate smart. We are combating pests and diseases. We're trying to deal with all kinds of risks, including climate and weather risk shocks. We're trying to increase the flow of nutrients in the system from fertilizers, but also from biological nitrogen fixation, using inoculants, using phosphorus, and even increasingly, I think, looking at micronutrients. We're taking all this science into account in the natural resource context that the farming community faces. And very importantly, at the heart of our strategy, when we think about intensification, we're thinking about information intensification, giving farmers better information about weather, about markets, about pests and diseases, about the technologies that are available. And we want to make diverse technologies as available as possible. It's not up to us to prescribe what farmers do. What we can do is work together in the science and this business and the government communities to offer them better choices. And the idea here is that ultimately by reducing risk and increasing upside productivity potential, we will foster capitalization of undercapitalized systems where poor smallholder farmers live. So we'll see more in the way of mechanization, irrigation, storage improvements, and we can do this in innovative ways that spread risk, service provision for planting, harvesting, etc., aggregation of input and output markets, and things like index insurance to reduce drought risk and again foster investment. And before I go on to speak more about drought, I want to say one more thing about sustainable intensification. You know the old saying, think globally, act locally. Well, that's what this is about. In the decade from about 2002 to 2012, after being flat for many years, land use expansion in global agriculture was increasing at the rate of about 10 million hectares per year, probably in part due to the high prices that were and the reduced stocks availability and so forth. Now, we can't sustain that in the long term. We need to intensify our production on better farmlands in order to protect forests, watershed, and biodiversity that inhabits these more fragile zones. So we need to flatten that curve of land use expansion. And how do we do that? By increasing productivity, by sustainably intensifying production on farmlands. And that, by doing that, is also a way to really combat poverty and undernutrition, because if we can do it in smallholder systems, everyone will benefit. And a drought is a very key risk that we need to manage to do that. So now let's turn more specifically to drought. So one of the first things I did when Rajiv asked me to talk was got in touch with Mark Rosegrant at IFPRI. Maybe you know his work. He does a lot of modeling. And in this case, he was modeling the effect of technologies on what we can expect in 2050, using impact models, crop growth models, and climate models from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And he measured those outcomes in human terms. The reduction in the number of malnourished children, and we're talking percentages that translate into millions here, or also in many, many millions, the population at risk of hunger. And unfortunately, look at drought. Drought is that thin little brownish line sandwiched between no-till and heat tolerance. You see it there? It's just that little thin line. I'm not very good with the pointer, but anyway, it's up there somewhere. The thin little line you see. I didn't believe that when I saw it. So I challenged him and I said, look, Mark, how can that be? We know that the models are unclear about precipitation in the future, the climate models, but still drought there's so many things about what we know about today's climate and likely future climate that suggest drought is maybe going to be a worse problem, not a better one, as we've already heard today from other speakers. And what he did then was share with me something else. He broke this down from a regional place to, this is looking at countries, a dozen or so in sub-Saharan Africa. And here, this is presumed on a drought-tolerant maize and being available with no yield drag. But what you see here is under drought conditions in these countries, many of which are the countries that investors like USAID and the World Bank and DFID and ACIAR care about very much, and India cares about them very much. India is a partner in these countries and investing there. The gains from drought tolerance can range from anywhere from 30 to 100%. So I think somehow in that global calculation that he did, the importance of drought tolerance was blurred. Frankly, though, this is talking about 2050. So it's really still somewhat, like a matter of speculation. And the real question, I think, is, well, what do we need to know to make judgments now and to take action now? So let's take a look then at the current climate. This is a slide I got from Walter Bathkin at the International Resources Institute at Columbia University. What you see here is temperature trends over the last 100 years, and you see them broken into the climate change trend in the upper left. The lower one is the decadal variability, and then in the upper right, the interannual year-on-year variability. And what you see is that by far the largest degree of variability is at the interannual. There are some areas where the trend is clearer, but it's patchy, as you can see. And by and large, farmers are dealing with variable temperatures that while the world is getting warmer, that variability is from year to year often swamped by the interannual changing. But we know that with a warming world, we will see more variation. That just happens when you put more heat into a system. We'll see more extreme events, things like droughts and floods. We'll see higher rates of evapotranspiration. And we're also, because of those extreme events and the higher rates of evapotranspiration, we're likely to see less groundwater recharge. All of these things suggest that drought could worsen in the future, and which is one of the reasons I challenged Mark when he showed me that initial graph. But now let's turn, since we're talking about rainfall, let's turn to precipitation. So here we go. There's the trend on precipitation. And remember, those models don't agree around precipitation, 5 to 10%. There's the decadal, 10 to 35. And look at the intraannual, 60 to 90% of the variation is explained by year-on-year variation. So this means that farmers are making their decisions based on this year being this much rain, this year being that much rain, the next one maybe 2 or 3 dry ones, then 2 or 3 wet ones. And that's what's driving their decision making. And we can't argue with that. They're making a very rational set of decisions. But the point here is there's no model agreement looking forward on precipitation. And I'll tell you, and I think this showed up in one of the slides that was shown, East Africa is always seen as getting wetter in the climate models. And what do we see? It's been getting drier for the last 15 years. So the modeling, the climate models around precipitation just aren't very clear. Now, let's drill down to an area that we all care about, those in the drought community, and that ICRISAT especially cares about. That's the situation in the Sahel. This is looking again at the last 100 years. The interannual accounts for 55% of the total variability. The decadal, 27%. So some decades are wetter, some are drier. And the trend, the climate change really, accounts for 18%. Even where it's more pronounced, as it is in the Sahel, farmers are still responding to a very unpredictable, variable climate that, again, leaves them with having to make decisions based on that uncertainty. Now, when we look at some data on yield gaps, that's the yield potential minus the actual yields that farmers are getting. This happens to be maize, but sorghum looks very similar. What we see here is that the yield gaps are actually highest in the very wet areas because the potential's so high, but those areas have other problems, and often they're not even maize-producing areas. But if you look at the heartland of the maize, you see yield gaps from anywhere from 3 to 6 tons or so per hectare. And what we would see, they're actually smaller, the yield gaps in the drier areas as you go north, for example, in Nigeria, but that's because the yield potential is high. What's much more important here is to understand that almost inversely, the coefficient of variation is much, much higher in the dry areas. So the lower part of Nigeria, the coefficient of variation is about 5%. If you go to the northern part of Nigeria, it's over 40%. So again, this underscores the variability, and this variability is a disincentive to investment. So let's take a look at more globally here to just demonstrate this. This reflects the effect of El Nino in the southern Africa going back many years, about 50 or so years. And then we see that again with variation approaching, coefficient of variation in maize yields approaching 50%. But look on the left at the top 5 maize producing countries, somewhere between 5 and 10, 12% coefficient of variation. So this is a part of the challenge that we face, and why the work you do in trying to deal with drought tolerance is so critical to delivering better outcomes for people across the Africa, Asia, and Latin America who face this tremendous variability. So what's the upshot of this? Well, I think the first thing is that we have to start by addressing the existing climate variability. El Nino is not climate change, but look at the devastation it's caused this past year in southern Africa. Right now, again, we see this terrible drought breaking out in Kenya and Somalia. So being able to cope with drought as we face it now is the first step to being able to cope with whatever Mother Nature holds in store for us 10, 20, 30 years from now. We're not going to get there we have to start from where we are to get to where we want to be. So, so this is, I think, a first key point. Now, fortunately, people have been working on this for a while, as you know, and we do have some really encouraging news. This is genetically based drought tolerance of drought-tolerant maize for Africa. It's incredibly gratifying to people who've been watching this. Well, it's gratifying now when you see the smile on her face, but for those who know that this has been a labor of love for 30 years, going back to people like Greg Edmeades and David Jewell and many, many others who have contributed to this. But very importantly, what's taken 30 years to accomplish here, and this really paid off very nicely this year in the El Nino year for Southern Africa's farmers. What's taken 30 years to accomplish there, using our new tools, we can really accelerate the pace of change. And I know we're going to hear a lot about this week. We already heard about this today, and I'll say a bit more on that. But before I do, here's another really important point. What you see there are the control, conservation agriculture, with the same maize, and the same maize with a legume conservation agriculture intercrop and conservation ag. It's the same maize everywhere. So the point here is it's not just about genetics. Look at the impact of the context, the soil health, the organic matter, the added nitrogen from the legume, into which that improved genetics is placed and deployed, where it can make much better use of residual moisture. It can make much better use of a healthier soil. It took 10 years to build this up, but you can see that the impact is absolutely tremendous. This is all rain-fed. So again, this is again during El Nino. So I want to drive home that point. Genetics, yes, but also agronomy, resource management, management of the system, yes, also. And we've got new things that there's coming along in this front. Let's look a little further here. This is this doubled up legume system that Sig Snap at Michigan State University has been working on for quite a while. And most recently, the government of Malawi has really embraced this. The idea here is instead of going maize, 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 you go pigeon pea with bean, groundnut, soy, and I expect those pigeon peas and groundnuts are from Micronutrient through partnerships with African programs, but a collaborative effort. Maybe the beans from CIOT in the national program collaboration, et cetera. And in the second year, you plant maize, and the pigeon pea grows back because recall that it's basically a perennial. And the implications of this are really very exciting. Here's a spider graph that shows you sole maize at the middle going around the outside. And what you see there is a two and a half fold increase in profit, twice the level of nitrogen use efficiency. And remember, in this case, they're actually using half as much fertilizer in the green line as they are in the blue line. And yet, look at the yields. Twice as much cover of the soil, which is very important to enhancing soil fertility. 50% increase in protein yield, which doesn't take into account the quality protein that legumes, that soy, that beans, that groundnut can provide, not to mention the oil in the case of groundnut or soy. Much greater water use efficiency. But there's one thing on this chart that's deceptive, and I'll show it to you. What you see there is, if you go back, you see the maize looks like it's just slightly increased. But that's because you're going to maize every other year, not every year. But look at the maize yields. The maize yield, regular maize, the little triangles way on the bottom, around 1.5 tons. And look at them in the green at the top, 4.5 tons. So even though they've shifted to maize every 2 years and are getting pulses, pigeon pea, soy, bean, and instead in the middle, you're greatly increasing the productivity of the system, even of the maize, and you're also really increasing the biomass, which, as we saw, makes the whole system more drought tolerant, especially when you put drought tolerant crops in it: groundnut, soy, pigeon pea, maize, sorghum, doesn't matter. And then also that because of that biomass, these farmers are increasingly integrating small livestock, pigs, goats, into their systems because they have more maize that they can feed and they have more fodder as well. So again, this is very important in terms of seeing a reduced risk system that invites investment, and it's potentiated by both better agronomy and better management of the crop rotation and better genetics and better drought tolerance. So one of the implications of reduced risks is that this map may change. You may know that Africa's leaders 2 years ago said that they wanted to double agricultural productivity by 2025 in the Malabo Declaration. It's not going to happen if that map stays looking the same, with Africa hardly using any fertilizer at all. And of course, policy, infrastructure, all those things matter to fertilizer markets, but so does production risk, so does drought risk. So we can be efficient. We can use half as much in that system we just looked at and be very climate smart about how we add nitrogen to the system. We can put legumes, we can put inoculant, phosphorus, and so forth in there. But it comes back to the idea that along with reduced risk, we need upside potential. Those two things need to go together. So with that introduction, it's way more than an introduction. I don't have that much more. I want to talk about how USAID approaches its investments, and particularly in cereals and legumes. So because legumes didn't have as much investment in them as cereals, we focused our investments in legumes on foundational pieces: SNP chip development, phenotyping tools, widening the genetic base. And phenotyping requires standardized data structures and downstream analysis. We're excited about things like the electronic field book from the breeding management system, which came out of the integrated breeding platform, and I know we're going to hear more about that this week. And collecting these data allows us to detect the effects of quantitative trait loci by environment. And there's a lot of, I've got listed some of the things that you need there. And you need to not only be able to characterize your environment well, you need to understand the biotic stresses that are happening. And while we seek to strengthen our partner capacity, be it in an international center and a university working together, or either a university or an international center or both working with national partners, we're seeking systems for ensuring seed purity, trying to lower the cost of genotyping in ways that can handle variable numbers of samples, and also deal with issues around methods where the quality of the DNA is not always what we'd want. To give you some examples then of the investments that we're making on the legume side, we have this SNP chip in the climate resilient cowpea lab, the broadening genetic base. We're looking at root phenotyping in beans. We're looking at tepary bean, which is a species that is native to the desert southwest of US and northwest of Mexico, very heat tolerant, very drought tolerant. And we're working with wild relatives of chickpeas with Doug Cook's lab at UC Davis. So all of these are sort of foundational investments that we think enable ICRISAT and all of you who are working on the pulse crops and the legumes to up your game and make more progress going forward. And just as an example of the kind of progress, remember I talked about how it could be sped up. This was a slide I got from Rajiv that basically shows you a marker-assisted backcross lines from using a hotspot of QTLs in chickpea. And the very encouraging thing here I see, Rajiv, is that you and your team and your partners in India, in Kenya, and in Ethiopia achieved higher yields with those improved marker-assisted selected materials in both more favorable conditions and in less favorable conditions. And this is very important because we need to make sure that when we enhance and minimize the downside risk through enhancing drought tolerance, we don't sacrifice upside risk, upside potential, excuse me. That will not be acceptable to many farmers. The two have to be married somehow. Another very interesting thing about this good news here is that when they studied after the fact these plants that were doing so well in the high yielding lines, whether they were in drier or wetter conditions, they found that the root system had been enhanced. So actually they had, unbeknownst to them, were actually dealing with a better, more effective root system. Now turning to the cereals, it's really more it's less about foundational investments and more about leveraging existing strengths. In the context of maize, a lot of that focuses on the private sector, but not solely. It's also work with universities and often, of course, with CIMMYT and IITA. But in sorghum, in millet, in wheat, and legumes, it's really more about public sector work. For example, at the top of the slide, we have applied wheat genomic labs, but also the climate resilient. I apologize, Kulvinder. He spoke this morning. We didn't get that on the slide, but we're using genomic selection for heat and drought tolerance for wheats in South Asia, and high throughput, low cost phenotyping methods for wheat across, helping CIMMYT up their game with respect to being able to handle large numbers of segregants and lines. So let's see, the last point I wanted to make is, okay. Basically, we're looking at technologies that can increase throughput. That was the point I was just making, but keep costs down and manageable. So, excuse me, ways that we can deploy some of the tools that are very sophisticated in more simple but still very effective forms that can be used in a more challenging environment. Another thing that I wanted to flag for you is I asked my colleagues back home before I came here, I said, well, what about the connection between heat tolerance and drought tolerance? And Larry Beach, who's known to some of you, I think, said to me, well, it depends. But what we found in the work, sorry, I've skipped a slide. No, yeah, sorry. What we found is that when we've invested in heat tolerance, and this is a public-private partnership with NARS and Indian seed companies and CIMMYT and Purdue University and Pioneer, we found that when we selected for heat tolerance in the spring season, we also unwittingly were selecting for physiological drought tolerance, because even though there was water on this irrigated maize, it was so hot that the vapor pressure deficit was so high that the leaf couldn't keep up with it, the root system and all couldn't keep up. Surprisingly then, when that same material was grown during the Kharif season in 2015, which isn't marked as a drought, but was a drought in many areas, these varieties that had been chosen for the hot season, even in the Kharif season, came out very well. And so again, it was basically that the physiological drought tolerance had been selected for alongside the heat tolerance that was really the focus of the selection. So point here is that heat tolerance can sometimes confer drought tolerance by selecting for physiological drought tolerance. And I gather that especially around flowering, many of the alleles are the same that are affected. Another example for maize, and this is just to show this isn't only our idea, this is the Syngenta Foundation and their work in partnering where the Affordable Accessible Asian Drought Tolerant Maize Public-Private Partnership. And what they focused on was reduced transpiration and flowering, and interestingly, deeper root systems. As we've been focusing that on bean, they were looking at that in the context of maize. And they have had very good results with materials now going out to seed companies across India. And just as we saw in chickpea too, that root system seems to confer a greater degree of drought tolerance. A point on that is that, dealing with roots, I don't know how many of you have worked with roots, but it's not easy. I think it's a little easier now than it was when I was in grad school, but I always felt sorry for the grad students working on roots because it was so tedious. But you need specialized equipment. And fortunately, ICRISAT has the rainout shelter. Together, CIMMYT and ICRISAT have the Rhizotronics facility. And it just strikes me that this is another potential area where, because of the capital this would require, maybe the idea that doing this kind of work here where you have that capital equipment and then sharing it in networks with partners around the world and with the NARS partners in particular, can help move the ball forward for everyone in a very cost-effective way that relies on international public goods. It's not a new concept. The idea that, you know, there's certain kinds of breeding that you can really advance when you have a high number of numbers, a lot of field, a lot of land, a lot of staff, but also specialized equipment. Strikes me too that the same argument might be made around upstream analysis by partnering, for example, with the Beijing Genomics Institute, where a partner like ICRISAT can leverage tremendous computing power, and other partners like that around the world. Staying with roots for a minute, but leaving genetics, we also know that seed treatment can do something. And this is not a product placement ad for Syngenta, but it's just to show you the upper part of the slide is the well-watered, and the lower part is the same soybeans grown under drought conditions. Look at the impact of the seed treatment in either case under the drier conditions. It really is very substantial, and also under the well-watered conditions. And we're looking at this. In fact, we're working with ICRISAT in West Africa, along with microdosing of millet. We're looking at seed treatments as well. And so this idea of you know, enhancing stand establishment through root growth, through better health, basically by combating rhizoctonia in the soil, can make a big difference. Tim Close at the University of Riverside also mentioned this, that seedling drought recovery in cowpea is very well correlated with yield and also high heritability. So good establishment, but also maybe, if we can, measuring good drought tolerance and resilience to drought in seedling stages can also be important. Another kind of drought, we've talked about mid-season, we've talked about establishment drought, terminal drought. And this, for the cool season legumes in particular, is a constitutive issue. And there's a reason for that. But it can also be, a terminal drought can also be an issue in semi-arid tropics and other areas. But I think what we have to think about when we look at terminal drought and its challenges for a crop like chickpea is understanding that it isn't just about water. And what we see here is that there's really a complex of pests and diseases that have a big impact on how farmers make decisions. They're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. If they plant early, they'll get diseases. If they plant late and get drought, they may also get diseases and pests and drought. So, you know, it's often the way we manage drought you have to think about the whole system. It's not just, this is another example that it's not just about the water. And it does illustrate, I think, the complexity of farmer decision making and the importance of our understanding her constraints and her challenges when she makes those decisions. So finally, take-home messages. Okay, last year we had, ICRISAT, in fact, convened this global Year of the Pulse meeting in Zambia with other partners. And Doug Cook spoke at that from UC Davis, and he showed a slide. And as I was finishing my talk, I looked at his slide and I said, you know, he's really captured a lot of the points that I would like to make. So I'm just going to use his slide, crediting him, of course. Basically calling for an integrated approach where we think about genetics, but also about agronomy, also about irrigation. We didn't talk about that today, but that's another aspect of that whole capitalization virtual cycle of risk reduction, productivity enhancement that I talked about. It's not just about water. There are many coincident environmental factors, heat, soils, biological factors, biotic stress, many small effect genes. So this idea of gene by genotype, by environment, by management, and that requires modeling. And I know there's going to be talks this week about modeling. I heard some mention of it today already. We didn't talk about it today, but this is the kind of challenge that the informatics combined with our better phenotyping ability and rigorous management of breeding lines can help take us forward. And then finally, that basic science is essential in the outcomes to the progress we make. Again, this is a little bit through a breeding lens, but he clearly acknowledges the importance of these other factors. And you can see the points he made there, and we've talked about them. And I guess the takeaway for USAID's funding, thinking about this, is that we will focus on translating basic discoveries of relevant drought QTLs and genes into our programs where relevant, while investing in genomic selection approaches and others, including leveraging new diversity or generating diversity, things like gene editing and so forth, that don't necessarily require a knowledge of specific gene function. That's probably beyond our ken. That's more for NSF to take on, or other funders, the European Science Foundation and other advanced partners. But that was sort of the take-home message for that. Now, those were Doug's, and they worked for me, but I have two more. And when I talked to my seed colleagues about this meeting, they said to me, "Oh, you have to talk about seeds." And I said, "Well, that's a very important point. We at AID, we're about getting the product to the farmer. The best science in the world, if it doesn't reach the farmer, isn't going to help her." So they said to me, they gave me 5 myths. Myth 1, research and genetics self-transfer. Myth 2, seed firms will automatically find your variety. Myth 3, the public sector is the answer to get seed to farmers. Myth 4, the private sector is the answer to get seed to farmers. And myth 5, we, researchers, donors, NGOs, are the transfer agents. So translating that into something I think more useful, basically we know when first of all, seed systems matter. They're vital. They're as important, I think, to achieving these really ambitious goals around 2025 in Africa, or 2030 for the Sustainable Development Goals, especially in areas where they're not as effective, and that's sub-Saharan Africa in particular. Hybrids will work for the private sector. Self-pollinated crops, the public sector has to step up. Early generation seed is a huge issue still, and very much there needs to be a prioritization by the public sector as to where it puts its efforts. We think they would go as far as really push them away from things like hybrid maize and towards the self-pollinated crops where public investment is absolutely critical. I would add to this that we don't want to really use research money for this. So that's why in USAID, I try to get our missions around the world to fund this work with us. It's a public-private partnership often. So it's exciting for them from the standpoint of institutional strengthening of the public and private sectors, but it's absolutely vital to get all the investments we're making to the farmers. And those kinds of funds, by the way, are more plentiful than research funds, which make up a fairly small percentage of development investments. Finally, the last thought I want to leave you with is this one. Incremental gains can translate into huge impacts. This was from a quote from Regis Ciccolo, who's a professor at the University of Zimbabwe and University of Michigan State University. He says, achieving modest but targeted improvements in our cropping systems can go a long way to achieving significant gains in resilience. In most cases, a crop needs to be able to resist yield losses for 3 to 5 additional days during a dry spell, not additional weeks or months. This can be through combined improvements in soil conditions and drought-tolerant varieties. Achieving specific minimum goals can result in dramatic gains in resilience. So in other words, we don't have to tackle long-term droughts to make a very big difference in the lives of the people we're trying to help. Finding ways to get crops through a few more days of stress can have dramatic impacts. And we can model what those stress points are and how long they have to be endured to have those big effects. A good example of this is the sub-1 rice, the submergent tolerant rice that we've heard so much about, it doesn't endure weeks more flooding than regular rice, but several days more, and that makes all the difference. And imagine how hugely that has been greeted and multiplied and talked about around the world. So you know, let's not let the perfect or the lofty be the enemy of the good and the practical and hopefully the achievable. So ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for listening all this time. I hope I've convinced you of the importance of your work, and certainly to us as a partner and investor in that work, but more broadly to reaching our shared global goals. And I'm very grateful to be with you this week, and I wish you all a great InterDrought 5 conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rao, for very impressive and very educative presentation. I think you covered all the different areas on which many of us have been working for last several years. And I'm sure that your presentation has set the scene to have the deliberations in next few days. So we are really grateful to you once again that you came all the way and then you have shared the views of USAID for the international agriculture, especially in that topic when you said the science to reduce the risk in the quest to end hunger. So thank you very much once again, Rao.